And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, for tonight, we have this low here coming up toward the Gulf of Alaska, the front moving well into Canada, and then pulling back, weakening though as it comes westward here, right over the Kenai Peninsula area. That's going to try to pull some light precipitation into northern Cook Inlet, definitely the Matanuska Valley area turning an arm, but mostly hanging up along the North Gulf Coast here. Stays wet and windy over the Panhandle with snow for Lynn Canal, Haynesboro area, looking for 5 to 9 inches through the night tonight into early tomorrow. Otherwise, that low for tomorrow tracks a little to the north here. South winds will continue to pull warm, moist air up into the southeast coast, eventually even to the northern areas in the afternoon as well for rain at sea level. And rain and snow here along the North Gulf Coast, increasing north and northwest winds here for the Susitna Valley, especially the western Brooks or the western Alaska range, Kodiak Island, and the marine areas there. Snow showers here along the west coast. Next system tracking into the northwest Bering Sea out of the Russian Far East. Moves almost to the Bering Strait by Wednesday afternoon, pulling really cold air down behind it into the northwestern Bering Sea and eventually sliding eastward here, especially behind the front. So snow and blowing snow, Yukon Delta, some light snow pushing into the Kuskokwim Valley, snow and blowing snow across the Seward Peninsula. Northwest coast areas with a lot of snow showers back over the northern Bering Sea with gusty north and northwest winds. Not too bad for the Aleutians, just a weak trailing edge dragging across the Fox Islands. And low pressure continues to weaken here in the Gulf of Alaska, but doesn't really move much. That's going to keep it unsettled with rain or snow for the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast. Maybe some light snow up into the western Copper River Basin to the Talkeetna Mountains. Northern Cook Inlet and Matanuska Valley, maybe the Susitna Valley could see some snow, dry to the north. Coastal water forecast, gale warnings for much of the coast tomorrow. South winds 35 knots. North coast, east-southeast at 30 knots, and small craft advisories for the inside waters. Clarence Strait looking at south winds at 30 knots, southeast 25 and gusty for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal. And for Wednesday, southeast winds 25, gust 35 knots here for Lynn Canal, southeast 25 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, south winds at 20 knots. And for, again, much of the coast now, south winds at 25 knots. The north coast still east-southeasterlies, but down to 25 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, north winds 20 knots, seas 3 feet. North to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast, north at 25. Western North Gulf Coast, variable winds, light variable winds for Cook Inlet, north of the Forelands, south of the Forelands, north at about 15. But strong gales here for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands out of the west-northwest at 45 knots with 12-foot seas. And that pretty much continues for Wednesday. Call it 40 knots out of the west for the Kamishak Bay area, but still northwest 45 for the Barren Islands. Cook Inlet, northwest winds 10 to 20 knots, north at 20 knots for Prince William Sound. North to east at 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, gale warnings tomorrow. Northwest winds 35 knots, seas 12 feet. Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, northwest winds at 30 knots. And for Wednesday, for the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Not much change for Bristol Bay as well, northwest at 25. And for Kodiak Island, west winds 40 knots, but 30 knots for Shelikof Strait. Eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots tomorrow, northwest 30 knots for the central Aleutians. And for the western areas out here, west to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And then for Wednesday, for the western and central Aleutians, all looking at west winds at 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, small craft advisories, west to northwest winds 20 to 30 knots, strongest across Unalaska Island. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, look for northwest winds, 25 to 30 knots. West 30-knot winds for the Pribilofs. Gale warnings for west winds at 35 for St. Matthew Island. And up there for Norton Sound, 25 knots for St. Lawrence Island. And then on Wednesday, southwest winds, 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island and the Yukon Delta Coast. West at 30 knots there for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. And strong northwest winds, probably accompanied by heavy freezing spray here in the northern Bering Sea with that much colder air coming down out of the Russian Far East. Seas up to 25 feet there for the northern Bering Sea and St. Matthew Island. West winds 35 knots with 20-foot seas for the Pribilofs. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, east at 15 for the central Arctic coast, as well as the west side there, east at 10 for the Beaufort Sea coastline. And then those winds swing around to the west, but only at 5 knots there for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southeast at 10 for the central Arctic coast, western coast here east at 10 knots, and the Chukchi Sea, east winds 25 to 30 knots.